The Three Questions. Once upon a time, there was a king who was wiser than all the kings who had come before him because he was always asking questions. And one day, the king finally found them. The questions. The most important questions he could possibly ask. And he quickly gathered together all his sages and all his wise men and all his advisors and said, I have it, I have it! First of all, what is the most important thing to do? The sages and the advisors all stroked their beards and started talking among themselves. But that's not it, he said. When is the most important time to do it? Because of course there is a time for everything. And also, who are the most important people? If I know the answers to these three questions, then I will be able to live my life well, and I will be happy. Well, the sages, the wise men, the advisors, they all started arguing and throwing answers back and forth, and each one had a completely different answer. And pretty soon, the king realized that they didn't know. They just thought they did. And that was even worse than saying that they didn't know at all. Well, very sadly, the king started wandering the palace when he overheard some of his servants talking. Because by now, everyone knew about the king's questions. He had promised much riches to anybody who could answer them. And he overheard the servants talking. I'll bet the hermit in the woods could answer those questions. Oh, easily. He is wiser than all the other king's advisors put together. Now the king's ears perked up when he heard this. The old hermit in the woods. Why, yes, he'd almost forgotten about him. There was a very old man who lived deep in the forest who, it was said, that he was the wisest man in the land, and the king, many years ago, had tried to get him to come and be part of his advisors and his council. He had offered him gold and riches and power and wealth and all sorts of things. But the old man said that no, he liked living in the forest, and he didn't like all the stress of all the wealth and the rich, and he felt uncomfortable around rich people. He said he preferred just living in his little cabin in the woods and talking to the common folk, the peasants, who would come with their questions. And so, the king decided, well, if the hermit won't come to me, I'll go to the hermit. Now, he did remember that the hermit had said that he felt uncomfortable around rich people, and the king didn't want the hermit to feel uncomfortable and maybe not answer him, and so he disguised himself, just like a common farmer, and snuck out of the palace and followed the path to the hermit's house. Now the king had been down this path before. He had gone to the hermit's house a few times to beg him to come work for him. And so it wasn't that far. He was cheerfully whistling a tune as he walked along and delighted that nobody had recognized him. Oh, he felt so free, not being followed by his bodyguards and his servants and all the people who were constantly asking him for things. This felt great. But the king didn't realize that someone had recognized him, actually. And this was a man who had been watching his every move for months, waiting for just such an opportunity as this. And as the king happily wandered through the forest, a shadow detached itself from its watching place near the palace and started following him at a safe distance. The king didn't even notice. And when he finally arrived at the hermit's house, the sun was already high in the sky and it was almost time for lunch. Well, the king hoped that hopefully the hermit would be able to answer him quickly and he would be able to get back home quickly before anybody noticed that he was gone. The old hermit was out working in the garden, hoeing. And the king came right up to him. "Wise man," he cried out, "I have been told that you could help me. I have these three questions that weigh on my heart. Who are the most important people? What is the most important thing to do? And when is the most important time?" "Oh," said the old man, straightening up. "That's very easy, actually. Yes, I know the answers to those questions. You see, the most important..." And the old man started to faint. He was quite old and frail, and he had been working quite hard for a long time in the hot sun, and The king rushed up to him and helped him to sit down. "Here, grandfather, have some water. Rest. Get your strength back. And then afterwards, here, eat some of these snacks that I brought. Afterwards, you can tell me your answers." "Oh," said the old man, "but I can't rest. I have to finish the garden. The weather is so nice today." Well, the king didn't want to leave without his answers, and he saw that the old man was working pretty slowly, and if he waited for the old man to finish the garden, then he was going to be there for a long time. "No worries. You rest. I'll work in the garden for you." And the king picked up the hoe. To his surprise, it was a lot heavier than he'd expected, and put it down on the ground. This was harder than he thought. Now the king was, after all, a king, and he'd never done a day's work in his life. And his hands were all soft and perfumed with the best lotions, and as he hit that hoe in the ground and realized that it was hard, he got mad. That hoe, that garden, they weren't going to get the better of him. He was a king, and so even harder, and he worked even harder, and pretty soon sweat was streaming down his brow, and his soft kingly hands were starting to get red and chapped and blister. And you know what? It felt good. It felt great. Because for the first time in his life, he could see the fruits of his own labor and feel strength coursing through his muscles. For the first time, more than a king, he felt like a man. And he was having so much fun. He didn't even notice how time had passed until he had finished the entire garden. He said, dropping the hoe and looking and seeing how the sun was sinking below the tree line. "I must get back to the to my house. They'll be worried about me. If I don't hurry, it'll be dark and it's not safe. Please, can you tell me my answers quickly?" "Oh, yes," said the old man. "Yes, I'd almost forgotten. Well, it just so happens that the most important And suddenly a man screamed and raced out of the forest straight up to the king and collapsed at the king's feet. And this man was clutching his side and blood was gushing out through his fingers. And the king had seen many wounds like this before in battle, and he had no idea who this man was. But he did know that if he didn't act immediately, the man would die. "Quickly," he said to the hermit, "boil some water, gather some clean cloths, help me with him." And he carried the man inside and placed him on the hermit's bed. And then he raced out to the forest and collected some medicinal plants that he'd noticed growing there. Because the king was quite wise and he was constantly learning, he knew exactly what to do. Out of the corner of his eye, the king watched the sun sinking lower and lower down the horizon, but he decided, never mind. And he carefully tended to the man's wound, managed to stop the bleeding, and after the bleeding had stopped, the king carefully sewed up that wound, gave the man some more medicinal herbs and tea, and waited. By now, it was dark. It was too late for the king to go back home, and only time would tell whether the man would survive through the night or not. And exhausted, the king sat down on the doorstep and leaned his head against the wall and fell fast asleep. And as the king slept, the man opened his eyes, and he saw the king sitting there, asleep, defenseless. This was exactly the moment that he had been waiting for. And the man, clutching his wound, started sitting up in bed and carefully reached down and pulled out a knife. The king woke up by the sound of the knife clattering across to the other side of the room. He saw the knife that the man had thrown over there in a corner, and he saw the man sitting up, clutching his side, staring at the king with bright eyes. "Friend," said the king warily, "I see you are better now. I'm glad." Don't call me friend," said the man. "Not yet. Not until you know who I am. Your Majesty, I am your great enemy, and I have been wanting to kill you for these many months, but I'd never gotten the chance to get close enough. But today, when I saw you leave the palace, I knew that you were going towards the hermit's house, and I followed you. Now, I didn't want the hermit to be blamed for your death, and so I hid along the pathway to wait for you to kill you on the way back. But I waited and waited, and hours went by, and you didn't come. And finally, I went to look for you, thinking that you had gone somewhere else, and your guards, who were searching for you, combing the forest for you, found me and recognized me and tried to kill me and left me for dead. But I got away from them and came to ask for help from the hermit, and instead I found you. And you bandaged my wounds. You stayed even though it meant that you would not be able to get back to the palace in the night. You sewed up my wound. You took care of me. And that tells me that you must not be the monster that I thought you were, if you are willing to do this for a stranger. Your Majesty, I am a man who always repays his debts, and I owe you my life now. I am sorry that I wished to kill you. I did not know you. I know that I deserve to die for what I plan to do, but if you forgive me and you give me a chance, I swear to you that I will be your most loyal friend to the end of my days. And in all his years of wisdom, the king had learned one thing very well, and that was to recognize the truth in a man's eyes. "Of course," he said, "you will be my friend. I will not punish you at all, because I believe that as long as we learn from our mistakes, that is what really matters. I will have my own physician take care of you back at the palace." And suddenly, just then, the king's soldiers burst open the door of the hermit's house. And they saw the king there, and they saw the king's enemy in the bed, and they drew their swords. But the king jumped up and said, "No! He is my friend. Take him back to the palace, and I will be with you shortly. But first, I need my answers." And he turned to the old hermit, who had been watching everything with a bemused smile on his face. Of course, he'd known it was the king all along. And the hermit said, "But your Majesty, your questions have been answered already. You don't need me." "What?" said the king. "When?" "Ah," said the old man. "Well, your Majesty, you see, yesterday, if you had not taken pity on my old age and helped me in the garden, then you would have continued on your way, and that man would have killed you. So I was the most important person. The most important thing you could have done was help me in the garden, and the most important time was when you were hoeing the vegetable patch. Later, when the man came, if you had not saved his life, well, he would have died, and you would have missed out on making a friend. And who knows, perhaps he will save your life in the future. You don't know how important he will be to you later on. So he was the most important person. The most important thing you could have done was take care of him, and the most important time was when you were bandaging his wounds. Your Majesty, it's very simple, and always remember this. The most important time is now, because that is the only time in which we have any power at all. The most important people are the people we are with now, because those are the only people that exist to us in the world, and we don't know whether they'll be the last people we ever see. We don't know how important they may become to us in the future. And the most important thing to do is to do good to the people you are with now, because it is for that purpose that we have been placed upon this earth.